It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Melissa Murray, the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU and Faculty Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. Her research focuses on the legal regulation of sex and sexuality. Together with Professor Siegel, who just moderated our last panel, and Kate Shaw, she edited the recently released Reproductive Rights and Justice Stories. Prior to joining the NYU Law faculty, Professor Murray was the Alexander F. and May T. Morrison Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, where she served as interim dean from March 2016 to June 2017. After earning her undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia and her law degree from Yale Law School, she clerked for Judge Stefan Underhill of the District of Connecticut and for then Judge Sonia Sotomayor on the Second Circuit. More recently, she launched the Strict Scrutiny podcast with Leah Littman, Jamie Santos, and Kate Shaw, and has also appeared on the Amicus podcast with Dahlia Lithwick, who we are honored to have here today. Professor Murray, over to you.
Thank you. Before I introduce our guests, let me first thank all of you for your engaged participation all morning. I know this is a long morning, but what an enriching and generative morning. And for that, I really want to thank our fantastic panelists and moderators who worked so hard to really think about the content of today's program and to really be responsive to our vision for a 19th Amendment that wasn't mired in 1920, but really spoke to the concerns of 2020. So thank you to all of you for that. I'm especially grateful to the terrific staff of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, Abby Seidner, our executive director, and Claire Whitman, who have worked tirelessly to make all of this come together and happen. And we are incredibly grateful to both of you for those efforts. This symposium is only one aspect of the BWLN's terrific work. We are working every day to support women at this law school and women in the profession, cultivating leaders for today and for tomorrow. And if you would like to know more about our Leadership Fellows program, the leadership training that we are doing at the law school, and our law firm initiatives to make this profession more inclusive and hospitable to women, please feel free to be in touch with us and also to follow us on Twitter at BWLN_NYU. Our guest today is no stranger to Twitter or the interwebs, where she has inspired a devoted following of fans and admirers. Dahlia Lithwick is a senior editor at Slate, where she has been writing their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns since 1999. Her work has appeared in a wide array of publications, including the New York Times, Harper's, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The New Republic, Commentary, and countless others. As Abby said, she's also the host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning bi-weekly podcast about law and the Supreme Court. In 2018, she received the American Constitution Society's Progressive Champion Award and was also inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She earned her BA in English from Yale University and her JD from Stanford, and she's currently working right now on a book that is soon to be forthcoming, Lady Justice, which will be published by Penguin Press. So, Lady Justice herself, Dahlia Lithwick.
Thank you.
So let me start with Lady Justice and read a little snippet from the introduction which you provided to me. When the framers of the Constitution conceived of a nation built on those democratic values, they couldn't have suspected that women would be at the heart of the fight to preserve them some 2 centuries later. Indeed, they were quite determined to ensure, despite Abigail Adams's importuning them to remember the ladies, that men had the rights and women the responsibilities. But in some ways, the women who fought to preserve equality and justice and privacy and dignity in the Trump era were perfectly located to inherit the mantle of radical constitutionalism created by James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. They are the wonky superheroes of a corroded era. They are going to use their brains, their words, and their capacious hearts to bring us back to the America that was meant to be. So this is a book about women sheroes living amongst us, hiding in plain sight. So who are some of the women in this book, and why did you feel compelled to write this story now?
Well, first of all, thank you. This is just a huge treat and honor. I increasingly find that the only solace I have is being in huge rooms full of women. And maybe I say that as the mother of 2 teenage boys and a male cat. But I just, this is like right into my veins. So thank you for having me and for the work that you're doing. And it goes without saying, there is nobody I would rather be in conversation with about these issues than Melissa. So I sold the book very, very soon after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And partly I had been working for several years on a book about the women justices at the court. And I was always very ambivalent about it because I felt that with an N of 4, almost anything I would say would be essentializing in ways that made me very, very uncomfortable. And sort of, for all that it was charming and interesting, I didn't want to say any version of all women such and such, because I had been covering, O'Connor and Ginsburg for so long. It was so clear they were totally different in virtually every way. And so I was always a little anxious about it. And then I think what happened to me within the first week of post-inauguration was watching 2 things. One, the Women's March, the first Women's March, which was just, and still is, in my view, one of the most extraordinary mobilizations I'd ever been privileged to be involved in. And what I call the airport revolution. Becca Heller and the people at IRAP and the ACLU showing up at airports, standing in baggage claim with their laptops, doing law. And I think I note in the introduction to the book that there was this gender valence even to that. There were so many women who just said, hey, I'm a tax attorney, but I'm going out to JFK because someone's got to do this. And that 4 of the 5 injunctions on the travel ban in the first 2 days were women judges. All of which is much more interesting to me than an N of 4. And so I think that the simple answer is the reason I wanted to do a book about the sort of women heroes of the legal resistance is because, A, I'm very anxious about this age of hagiography we live in. And while I own the Ruth Bader Ginsburg mug and tote bag and also earrings, and also the hat. Oh, and the votive candle. I have all those things, but I also truly believe that just continuing to buy RBG swag is not going to get us out of this. And so what I really, really wanted to do was, I loved whoever said, if you can't see it, you can't be it. We're seeing it. Okay, it's good. Women are in power, but if you can't actually step into your own and realize that we have to be the heroes here, and that Ginsburg, bless her heart, at 87 cannot fix this, but all those lawyers who showed up in the baggage claim, every single 1L who just steps into power is what's going to do it. And so that it was very much, I'm as inspired by those women that I write about as I am by RBG, and I want us to be able to see ourselves in them, because almost none of the women in this book, and you asked me who's in it, Sally Yates, Robbie Kaplan, Vanita Gupta.
NYU.
Yeah. I've tried very hard to find women who in 2015 never believed that they were going to be the leaders of the resistance, and that I wanted it to be a book about people who kind of torqued on a dime and stepped into a thing that they never thought they'd be doing, and that we could all be that person. So that's, I think, the answer.
So that is super inspiring. And now I'm going to take us to a very dark place.
Please,
Okay.
that's I live there. Yeah.
I'm there with you.
Yeah.
In 1920, the suffragists saw themselves as heroes of their own lives too, stepping forward, marching, making change, going where no woman had gone before to do things that no one could have imagined. And yet today, you see the same impulse. These are almost parallel movements, maybe more inclusive and who is also at the table, but why do we need to continue being heroes of our own lives?
Well, because no one's going to give it to us. We're going to have to take it and wrest it from a set of systems that haven't changed that much since the 1920s. And I think we all believe, look, you and I both went to law school when there was parity. You know, there were more women than men in my law school class, and we all believed, I think I stupidly believed in 1993, that we would have parity at, you know, big law, and we would have parity in the academy, and that we were really, it was done. And I think we, in some sense, didn't realize that it's kind of still 1920 in a lot of ways. And I think that part of it is complacency, and part of it is I think we still don't quite know what it looks like and feels like. I think that it is so interesting to me. I always tell this story, and some of you have probably heard it, and Melissa's heard it, but I always tell young women lawyers that everything you need to know about how cases get handed out at law firms is just exemplified in the following exchange. There's some fantastic case, and it's about fishing law. And there is some woman at the table who has like a master's degree and a PhD from Oxford on the law of the sea, and has written 2 books about it, and actually like really is like fluent in maritime law. And there is a guy sitting next to her who is eating a tuna sandwich. And he will say, like, I am an expert in the law of the sea, for I am eating star-kissed tuna. And she will be like, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't know it well enough, let me do some research. And like, this would kill me, that I just saw this play out over and over again, that I think, and even today, I'm being flip, and obviously, like, tuna is not the marker, but I do still see when I call a woman, on almost every time I say, can you bang out 1,200 words for me on this? You've written the case book on it. The answer is almost unerringly, give me 2 weeks. Like, I need to research it. I don't know it well enough. I'm not sure. I don't want to be wrong. Whereas there are, and I'm not going to name them, an awful lot of men who are just like, yeah, I don't know anything about it, but I wrote 10,000 words on it. Here it is. Why don't you pick out the good parts and publish it? And so I just
I feel myself in the story.
Yes, I am too.
Well, so you have asked me to bang out something in 12 overnight, and I've said no, not because I needed 2 weeks, but because that night I had to go buy cupcakes and then ding them up to make them look homemade, because I had to bring them to a kid's school. I mean, so part of this is, I think, the challenge of individual women stepping into their authority, but a lot of it is systemic. Like, I have no problem acknowledging that I could have written 1,200 words for you if I didn't have to make these stupid cupcakes, or if my husband was not at work for zillions of hours at a law firm and he could make the cupcake. So we struggle with this at the Burn Mom Wins Leadership Network. Should we be focusing on programming that equips our students to step into their power, and that's really what we should be focusing on, or should we be focusing on burning it all down? Because you're only doing a half step if you teach people how to thrive in a compromised environment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was the one who was famously like pumping breast milk during like all of the confirmation hearings, like plugged into like some disgusting bathroom, in the Senate, and like it's, and crying, just crying through hearings, because this is not how I wanted, to like then book to Charlottesville with like, totally hinky milk that like my husband had to give my kids so that I could, like, this is not a life. And here's where I will just tell you, when I I asked Slate for a book leave, and they said, you have to take the book leave that all the men take. And I said, what's that? And they said, they defer their paternity leave for like, 6 or 7 months. And then they take those 3 months as their book leave. And I was like, and yet, like, I have stitches and had like a baby and didn't get to defer my, like, that's not a policy. That was our book leave policy. Mm-hmm. And so every single thing is a fight. It's always.
You need to talk to Sarah Brafman.
Yeah.
She can help you.
It's not that, there is now a policy in place, but it's just the idea that you have to fight on 2 fronts every day is crazy making. And just as to this question of, burning it all down, I mean, look, we are watching, as we watched last year with Christine Blasey Ford, and we really all, you more than anyone, walked into those hearings and saw something happen, and then saw it get erased. And I think we are living in a really strange moment where there is like a split screen, and there is one world in which we are very powerful and very mobilized, and there are a lot of, amazing and impressive women in Blue Waves who are taking their power and performing for all of us to sort of admire and emulate. And then there's a world in which it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And it is so profoundly strange to think that we live in a split screen world and that we're not, no matter sort of what benchmarks we achieve, we're not getting to where we need to be, even to burn it all down. Mm-hmm. I just never thought in my life we would be sort of moving sideways.
So I want to go back, I want to bracket going sideways for a minute, but can we go back to the Kavanaugh confirmation? You wrote in November a searingly visceral essay about covering the Kavanaugh nomination and confirmation hearings, and then your personal decision to burn it down for yourself by refusing to cover the Supreme Court beat for Slate any longer because you didn't, these are not your words, didn't want to be complicit in sort of legitimating what you saw during those confirmations. Can you talk about that essay a little bit?
Yep, that was the essay. It was, a couple of things. One is it was very strange to be in the room for the Kavanaugh hearings, because I think experiencing it on television was profound in a lot of ways, and actually being in what was a very small chamber, and also sort of, again, this split screen. I was sitting at a table surrounded by women journalists, which is very different from sitting at a table surrounded by male journalists, and I was watching, like, I think I described it as like their shoulders were, as Judge Kavanaugh was shouting, their shoulders were sort of creeping up around their ears, like they were having a physical reaction. And I think I also described in the piece, I'm not sure, that my son, who was 15, was watching it here in New York at school, and during the break was quite like afraid for me, texted me and said, "Are you okay in there, Mom?" Like thinking I was unsafe. And of course I had to text back and say, like, he is not a danger to me or himself. He's just, performing. But that really affected me. And we have this job in the press, which is then to just write, which I think I might have done that night, just to sort of, just the facts, ma'am, dispassionate, here's what happened. But I really felt quite bruised. And I also was one of many, many people, I'm sure many of you are those people, who is still a little PTSD about what Dr. Blasey was describing. And so it was very hard for me to think about just sort of sailing into the Supreme Court the next week and writing, Justice Kavanaugh says this, and then he chuckles with Justice Kagan, and then I'm part of normalizing and giving cover to something that, and I should be clear, I think I have also written, I actually thought there should be yellow crime scene tape around the Merrick Garland seat. I just thought that also, going in there and just acting as though something astounding had not just happened, which is our job in the press corps, and it's a very small c conservative press corps. I didn't feel like I could contribute to that and feel like I was not marking what for me was just sort of still an open wound. And then I was just gutless for a year. I just would make up like I have a cold, and my car broke down. And at some point my editors said, "It's a little weird that you've had this cold for 8 months." And then I said, "It seems
the coronavirus."
Yeah, exactly. It seems I will not be going to the court. And then we talked a lot about writing it, and I didn't want to write it, and then I wrote it, and then I actually wrote to Riva right after that the most amazing, unforeseen response to that piece was the number of constitutional law professors who wrote to me, or people who taught Supreme Court seminars, who said, thank you for giving voice to this. I canceled my seminar. I'm not teaching this year. And my response was like, no, I can drop out. You cannot drop out. And it was really a lesson in, and I wrote some of this stuff about Judge Kaczynski too, but like complicity is really complicated. And declaring that you don't want to be complicit in a system that is just perfectly happy to go on without you is unbelievably complicated. And the notion of any person not teaching con law this year because of a confirmation hearing like scares my face off. And so, which is just a long sort of free associative way of me saying that it was the right decision for me, and if everybody had decided not to cover the Supreme Court, we would be in trouble. So
I really worry about what you're saying, because I think, like journalists, law professors, if they really take the enterprise seriously, have an obligation to sort of present both sides of something. And I am teaching constitutional law this semester. I taught impeachment yesterday. And I don't think I've ever quite been tested to sort of present information like a history, a long litany of cases and whatnot. And we got to this one case from 1982, Nixon versus Fitzgerald, where the court confers to the president absolute liability for civil suits for money damages that arise out of official action. And there's this dissent where they talk about, well, the president would now be a king. And the response that the majority gives is that, no, there are remedies. There are alternatives and remedies for this. Impeachment, the press scrutiny, the concern about one's long-term legacy. And I'm like telling this to my class, and they're looking at me like, are you kidding? Like, what are you talking about? And then I had to bracket for them, like, it hasn't always been like this.
Yeah.
And like there you are, like Jennifer Lopez, a lady of a certain age, not like Jennifer Lopez. And there was something before this.
Yep.
And I don't even know how to tell you what that time was like, but it wasn't like this.
I had a similar, I've only once done an editorial statement on the podcast in all the years that we've had it, and it was after the election when I said, and I didn't write it, I just said it, and my producer was like, really, we're going with that? And I was like, let's go with that. But I just sort of said, look, I've always on this podcast had, Paul Clement was a repeat guest. I've had lots of guests that I don't agree with or who are on the other side of a case that I think is easy. And it was really important to me to do that. And after the 2016 election, I said, look, I'll continue to have, Republicans and conservatives and whatever on the show without a question, but I won't have anybody come on and lie. And if somebody is, and this was sort of associated with the travel ban case, like if you're going to try to make a good faith argument that this has nothing to do with the tweets and the stuff that was still up on the campaign, page about banning Muslims, like I cannot give cover to lying on the show because then I am legitimizing an idea that there's two sides. And it is so hard, right? This is the fight that everybody's having about Nancy Pelosi, right? Is, how do you sort of evince in a both sides, sort of pearl-clutching civility, norms world that you've given up on the norms and you're just gonna rip the speech. And I think, I tell my children to this day, like when they go low, you go high, and they are like, you're an idiot. And, that's just bad, stupid advice. And so I think that there's the problem with comity as expressed in everything I learned in law school is it assumes good faith, right?
Well, I also think the whole idea, this kind of discourse of etiquette and civility is one that is especially pertinent to women and especially silencing of women. Like, I think we take the critique of being uncivil to heart in a way that maybe others do not. To call Nancy Pelosi Petty Pelosi for ripping up the speech. Lots of people have been petty at the State of the Union. I remember the guy who said, "You lie,"
right.
During President Obama's speech. And he was criticized for it, but this idea that there had been something deeply uncivil about ripping up a piece of paper as opposed to screaming at the president during a speech, the disconnect seems jarring, and I wonder if it is gendered in some way.
You know, it was interesting. I lived in Charlottesville for 18 years, and we moved 4 days after the Nazis. Not causal, just happy accident. We were, you know, the moving trucks were parked in the driveway when it happened in 2017. And it was really useful to be there that summer of 2017 where we were trying to figure out, you know, across the community, how to respond to what we knew was going to be hundreds of Nazis armed to the teeth. And there was so much discussion of civility, so much discussion of politeness and, you know, not responding in kind. And it was incredibly useful to go to, like in my case, going to some of the black churches and hearing what being scolded in civility, you know, how that registers for people who, you know, it's just a way to silence.
Yeah.
And we are still fighting 2 years later in Charlottesville about, you know, I joke that in my synagogue alone, there were literally 3 camps of how we're going to deal with the Nazis in August, and it was like being workshopped for 3 weeks. And we had the like senior emeritus rabbi who was like, we're doing the KKK thing, you know, that we heard from Skokie. We're hiding in our basement, closing the curtains, and, you know, pretending they're not there. And then the sort of hippie Woodstock rabbi who's like, I'm going to go to the alternate space and like play folk songs with, you know, the Dave Matthews drummer, and, you know, we're going to like have rainbows and it's going to be beautiful, and that's our response. And then our like little baby rabbi who'd been ordained like 6 minutes before, who was out on the street like locking arms with, you know, the pastors of all the churches, who was getting punched and hit and saying like, I'm not seating my streets. And we were all having these debates. First of all, it was hilarious to watch entire families be like, I'm going to the hippie rally and I'm going with Antifa. You know, like we were all trying to figure out where we belong, but it was just a fight about civility. Mm-hmm. And it was so ridiculous in the face of like actual Nazis with flaming torches that we were fighting about what is going to look bad on the news.
Is that a way to divide us? I mean, would we be better off just sort of like coalescing around a strategy, whatever it is, and just going with one strategy as opposed to dividing ourselves among many different strategies?
I mean, I have to say, and I was going to ask you a version of the same question, Melissa, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that I am fundamentally the most conservative radical in the world. And I believe in the law, and I believe the courts are going to save us, and I believe in, you know, what Robbie Kaplan is doing in her Charlottesville lawsuit. I believe in, you know, what the leadership conference, I mean, I really believe that we have to fight for our courts and fight for our norms. And in the sort of 2 years since I've sold the book, you're watching the courts change in front of your eyes. You're watching absolutely unbelievable implications of the court changing in front of your eyes. And I think that we are all living through some version of, you know, I'm doing this podcast series, this 5-part series right now with Rick Hasson on elections. And it's the most like freaking chilling thing because he's just chunking out, you know, this is what's going to happen when people are incompetent. All of which, by the way, happened in Iowa this week. Every one of our sections happened in one day in Iowa. But, you know, hacking, interference, you know, vote suppression. And I'm listening as we're taping it to this fundamental tension that every lawyer has, which is I still have to fight for the system. And if people listen to this podcast and come away saying my vote is pointless and I should just like give up on voting and just, you know, pick up something pointy, then like we're in big, big trouble. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, if you listen to a 5-part podcast about how eminently screw-upable the 2020 election is, you would be very, very insane to think that your vote matters. And I think we're all living on the seam of that, the seam of at what point is trying to bolster a legal system that we know is totally structurally flawed to begin with, and at what point do we just say it's broken And it's very fun because in every iteration of the podcast so far, I've sort of teased Rick about the fact that he's like, but, despite all the vote suppression, it's only a couple points, so get out there and believe in the system. And you can feel that anxiety sort of simmering under the podcast. It's the thing that's simmering under you teaching impeachment, and it's the thing simmering under me opting out of covering the court. And it's just this same question. We are in a room of people who believe in rule of law, but in the face of nihilism, at some point, I don't know. I don't know how you fight on two fronts at once.
So I definitely feel that tension. I think a lot of people in this room probably feel that tension. I mean, again, I'll go back to the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We struggle with this idea of equipping individual students and making sort of individual interventions, whereas we understand that there are truly systemic impediments in the legal profession that need to be addressed as well, and sort of like which comes first, right? And I think I struggle with that constantly. Being an African American woman in legal academia, when I was a law student, there was no black woman law professor where I went to law school. And I think you could have packed it all in there, or you could say, okay, maybe I'll be the first, and then I'll bring another person along, and then there's someone at Stanford, and then, and then maybe there's enough of us that we can do something. But then you come back to, we are still 7% of the legal academy, not black women, but women of color more generally, and we have been for a really long time. And then I sort of wonder, what was it all for? What were we doing? But then I look at my students and I'm like, you can do this. We can bring, you're coming next, and you know that it can't look like this forever. I mean, we are constantly in this, I think, cycle of rejuvenation and regeneration. And I think if we weren't in that cycle, we would just all pack it in and die or something. Because that is the only way to go forward, to just assume that it has to get better, it must get better, that we can somehow individually do something that collectively will make it better.
So the one and only thing that I want to push back on is,
because we've taken it to a really dark place.
No, I'm not going to take it to a better place. Rest assured, it's going darker. But it's interesting in reporting on, some of the Title VII stuff, in reporting on some of the Me Too stuff, the through line in almost every woman who comes and says, and by the way, I had one yesterday, every day somebody calls and wants to decide if they want to tell a story. And unerringly, they say, this is bad for me, it's bad for my career, it's bad for my life, but I need to protect the women who are coming after. And I don't know if there's an analog in guy world for that. Yeah. But it is unfailing. The sort of I have to take responsibility for the people who come after me, and I don't even want, sort of reparations. I don't think I can be made whole. But I'm willing to, take a hit to my career so that this doesn't happen to anyone else again. Mm-hmm. And part of me thinks that's an amazing, right? It's like at this table where every one of them was like, I'll give you my scarf. And I was like, I have that scarf. But I think there is this incredible, generous impulse. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's really problematic, right? Because we can't only be doing it for, so that other people don't get hurt. And it's another form of sort of silencing or sidelining that, we feel like we have to do this so that it doesn't happen to someone else, rather than, I want to be made whole here, and I'm entitled to that. And so I think a little bit of that worries me. It isn't to say we should be ungenerous, but there is such, for me, just such a strange formulation in the only reason I'm calling you is I don't want him to do it to someone else.
As opposed to I want to be vindicated.
I want to be made whole because this guy wrecked my life. And there's very little comfort in that. And I sort of say it.
We see that all the time, that women have to be sort of selfless. It's not enough to want to be ambitious because you want to be, but because you're doing it for some other selfless reason, like your children or whatever. When I was a clerk, my co-clerks and I watched insane amounts of television, including America's Next Top Model. And there was always this narrative that the would-be models would tell, like they were doing this for their children. I'm like, you're doing it because you're a fame whore. That's fine. That's okay. Like, you don't have to sort of manufacture some reason why you want this. Like, you want it for you, and that's okay.
I think I wrote, this is utterly unresponsive, but it flitted across my head, so I'm just going to go with it. I wrote a piece after Pam Karlan was called out for exactly, being the one woman who told a joke, in her testimony, and then, like, you all know this, like, they had to escort her out of the Capitol with, like...
She received death threats.
Yeah, no, I mean, she honestly couldn't be safe in her home for a little while after that, and what did she do that was so different from what Noah Feldman did, or from, Jonathan Turley or Mike Klarman? Gerhardt. She made a joke, and it's that same, like, this is the bandwidth in which, like, women can occupy public space. It wasn't a super funny joke, and maybe if it had been, like, laugh out loud, vintage Pam Karlan, it would have been okay, but, like, it is ridiculous that became the thing, and it goes to this question of, you're trying to tell women, you're trying to tell your students, I spend my life telling young women, like, step into this, don't wait to be invited, and then they witness this, like, boom, 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 like what happened to Christine Blasey Ford could happen to you. And I think one of the things that's been problematic for me with the book is, again, that sense of, we're watching, like, Marie Yovanovitch on a split screen, right? We're watching this woman who is the model of what we want our daughters to be. Mm-hmm. And yet, like, she's the villain, she's the bad guy, she's the one who, has to quit her job and is going to be reviled and probably, investigated for something now. It's very hard to keep telling these stories to the people who come behind us when we're kind of like our fingers are crossed behind our back.
But then on the flip side, there's the, I think, quite inspiring and uplifting image of Fiona Hill, who was just absolutely unflinching in the face of both public questioning and critique. I mean, and happily told Jackie Spire that story about how she was a young girl in Manchester, England, and some terrible boy set her pigtails on fire while they were taking a test, and what did you do? I put it out with my bare hands and I kept taking the test.
Yeah.
like amazing.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, we do have these glimmers of inspiration and hope, I think, and maybe that's what keeps us going. I mean, like, for every Marie Yovanovitch that gets dragged through the mud, there's a Fiona Hill who refuses to be brought down.
Yeah, and these Parkland kids, like, I interviewed them last year, and I was just like, I interviewed the women just for they were getting Glamour Women of the Year awards, and I got to talk to these women, and they're so much smarter than we are, and I'm not saying that to pander. They just don't want to do a lot of the dumb stuff we're wasting our time with, and they sort of just cut through it. And if you ask, like, a stupid question, like, they'll just say, that's just a stupid journalist question, and be like, okay. So there is a way in which I do think we are inadvertently raising up, generations behind us that are very powerful in ways that we don't know about yet. And look, my God, Greta Thunberg, she was given Glamour Women of the Year award this year, and didn't bother to show up. But then in her speech, she sort of said, I can't believe that I've never cut my hair and I only shop at secondhand clothing stores, and Glamour is giving me an award. Like, totally trolling Glamour, like, in her acceptance speech, same thing, like, at Davos. I mean, I just think to not be bothered with our silliness, I don't know where they get it. And I would just say, like, my kids, like you're, describing your students, like, my kids who are teenagers almost don't know that this isn't normal. Like, almost think it is, a normal thing to have the life we're living now. And I have to keep reminding them, like, my biggest worry in, like, the 1980s growing up was, like, does Eric Usher love me? You know, that was it. That was it. And that movie The Day After. But like, I did not, you know, think about every single day getting gunned down in school the way they do. And yet, I don't know how to communicate to them that it was better and it could be better when they're like, just like, this is the only thing they know.
Yeah. So, interestingly though, they occupy a world that is, like, some things are very different in ways that are profoundly problematic, but also very different in ways that are, again, very hopeful. So when I was a girl, the only woman on the Supreme Court was Sandra Day O'Connor. Like, to my daughter, like, it's like of no consequence that there should be more than one woman on the Supreme Court. She's sure one day that there will be 9. There are 3 now, but there will eventually be 9, she thinks. She now lives in a world where there are all of these women in Congress, and they're young women too. And so that's a profound change. So shouldn't we take hope in some of these really monumental events? I mean, maybe the 2020 election cycle that's coming up is not going to be a hellscape, but a vindication of the kind of impulse that you chronicle about the Women's March and the power of women's voices when directed in a single direction.
So 2 things. One is, like, I haven't actually finished the book, in part because, like, the Christine Blasey Ford Me Too chapters, like, almost killed me, and I just needed to sort of figure out where the story goes from there, and I'm still struggling with it, like, 3 months after the manuscript in final was due. But also because I really believed that the last 2 chapters were going to be about a woman on the ticket who went to law school, and I'm not 100%. There may still be. I suspect there will be a woman on the ticket, but watching particularly just the discourse around how much we hate women in this country right now is just staggering to me. And so, like, I do have a lot of hope, but it kind of goes to my split screen problem of I just don't know that I'm living in the world that finds Elizabeth Warren, you know, monstrous, and Amy Klobuchar, you know, hideous, and Kamala Harris, like, terrifying. I don't live in that world. I think every one of them would have been the best last chapter of my book ever, and Stacey, and, like, one of them hopefully will be. But just the idea that this is unreachable is shocking, and that we're using, like, the exact language we used in 2016, like the exact
and
critiques.
1920.
And 1920 and 1804, and by the way, like in the you know, Shakespeare, like, this is the way we talk about, you know, cunning, devious,
shrewish
women. So that's a little worrying. But here's the thing that I do say to people when they're, like, drinking bourbon from a flask under their tables, because I've just depressed them. I do think.
I thought you were going to say they were all in Congress.
Drinking bourbon from a flask. No, I think I have been saying to women this year that I think almost as important as having 3 women on the Supreme Court, which is something that, for me too, you know, when I started covering the court, there were 2 women, then there was 1, and that was really watching Justice Ginsburg try to reconfigure herself as the only. Was really a fascinating thing.
Well, she had this terrific line. She came to NYU and was talking about that sort of interregnum year between when Justice O'Connor stepped down and 2009, when I guess it was 4 years, when Justice Sotomayor was appointed to the bench. She said, "There I was, all by myself, with these very well-fed men." And yes, so I mean, she felt it quite acutely.
Yeah, she felt it, and she talked about it. And after the Redding case, she actually blurted it out. You know, while the case was pending, said to Joan Biskupic, like, they have no idea what it's like to be a teenage girl strip searched in her school for ibuprofen. Like, she says it, but I also think it's interesting because I think that the women lawyers' briefs in June Medical, the women's lawyers' brief in Whole Women's Health, I think that is as profound a movement as having 3 women on the court. And I think that when I I said this on the podcast a few weeks ago, and Mark Stern teased me, but I now have the sort of Yellowstone camping view of the court, which is like when you go to camp at Yellowstone and they say if you see a bear, like really the only thing you can do is look larger than you are, which is just really seemingly stupid advice if a bear is going to eat you. But like, if you have nothing else, looking larger than you are is not a bad default. And I think that this is a time for women to look larger than they are in front of the court. And that means sort of dragging this split screen into the sort of awareness and minds even of justices whose minds are made up. And so I think when women kind of get together and write a brief and say, you know, I terminated a pregnancy and this is why. And again, there's a part of it that is pain porn, you know, like I have to disclose to the justices that my family is going to cut me off, and, you know, like that's awful. And women should not be carrying that burden. But at the same time, I think that it is so important to be huge right now, and to sort of decline to be erased, to decline to be sort of sidelined or told, like, you know, don't worry your little heads. And so I know that be bigger than you are at the Supreme Court for us is really not as good as, you know, we have 6 women on the court and, you know, we're reversing centuries of structural injustices. That's what I thought we'd be doing now. But I think that really refusing to just go quietly and refusing to be silent, and you see the numbers of women arguing cases. It's shocking. I mean, you clock this.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable that we are not doing any better in any of these sort of metrics than we were when I started covering the court 20 years ago. So I just think it goes back to like, be the tuna sandwich you want to see in the world. Like, you just have to say, like, you know who's going to argue a case at the court? Me. And you're, I guarantee you, as good as many of the men who just swan in there and do it because they knew a guy. So I think it's that.
So on Monday, I was in DC for an event at Duke Law School commemorating the 16 women who are the editors-in-chief of all of the top 16 law reviews, which is an enormous feat. It has never happened, to my knowledge, in the history of legal academia until this year. And they published together a joint issue called Women in the Law that's, I guess, available online right now. But one of the essays is from Lisa Blatt, who is this fantastic Supreme Court litigator who's argued many, many cases in front of the Supreme Court. One of the few women to do so. And one of the things she says is just sort of like, no one's going to give this to you. You've got to take it. And like she talks about all of the, no woman ever comes to her and says, you know what? I can totally see myself arguing this case. She's like, I've never heard anyone but women say, I couldn't imagine that I would one day be arguing before the court. She's like, why do we, like, what's that about? Like, why can't we imagine more than this? Which is amazing because in 1920, these women who probably had no experience of what it looked like to vote was like, I can totally imagine myself going to the ballot box and picking a candidate. And in fact, I'm going to make that happen. So how do we harness that kind of radical centennial energy, make it more inclusive, update it, and then bring it forward?
So just anecdotally, I will tell you, again, this is going to seem unrelated, but it's hilariously funny. I was telling Melissa, we just finished, we did interviews with everyone who entered Ruth Bader Ginsburg's class at Harvard in 1952, with all the women who are still alive. There's only a couple of them that are still alive, and they're families of the ones who are deceased. And so I got to sit down with Justice Ginsburg last week and record the final piece of this, which is her reflections on all these women who were in her class. There were many funny things about it. I think it's going to air next month, and I guarantee, like, she was, because she's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like sipping tea from a bone china. Like, she did not offer tea to anyone in the room. She had, and so then you hear this sort of
your own.
clatter, 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 and then she's sipping more tea. But it was fascinating because I expected when we set out on this that each of these women was going to be Lisa Blatt. Like, they were all going to be like, oh, of course I went to Harvard Law School in 1952 because I wanted to, you know, do this and that and change the world. Virtually every one of them trailed a man. And several of them describe in graphic detail in the interviews that they got their husbands at Harvard Law School in 1952 because they started cooking. They were cooking for the men who couldn't cook for themselves, and they all met guys that way. And I kept waiting for the like, where's the person who just wanted to change the world? And like most of them were just like, yeah, it seemed like it'd be kind of fun. Or my dad went there and, he had a good time. Like there was just, and I was really struggling with it. And I asked Justice Ginsburg, like, what, these are like the pioneers? And she was like, yeah. She just was like, and I said to her, that famous question that Dean Griswold asked her about, why are you here taking the spot of a man? And she said, because I want to help Marty. But I asked her, what would your real answer have been? Like if you could just tell him to his face what you really wanted to do. And she just said, I just wanted to be a lawyer. Like that was it. And so I think that there's a weird way in which, like, I don't want to ask women to be superheroes, because I think like so many of our superheroes just wanted to be a lawyer, and that's enough. And I think that there is this, I know I'm saying two things at once. I'm saying like be the tuna sandwich guy and step into your power and like grab it the way Lisa is describing. But I also think like do your thing, do it really well, just have confidence. Like I think that it doesn't have to be, I don't know that we all have to be, and even Ginsburg to this day isn't the sort of, badass, gangsta, that everybody thinks she is. She's like the most conservative, she's really the most conservative radical in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just fine to be a bunch of lawyers doing law and not swinging for the fences. But I also think, we don't sideline ourselves. There's like a middle space.
Well, I think your book makes that point. Like in the book, most of the women you chronicle are just ordinary lawyers doing their thing. Robbie Kaplan is at Paul Weiss, being a great corporate lawyer, but that's what she's doing. Becca Kaplan has just had a baby, and they step into a moment, right?
Yeah.
Like the circumstances are created by a moment, and they step into it, but they don't necessarily go into it like, I'm going to change the world, or like, I'm going to bring down the Defense of Marriage Act. But an opportunity presents itself, and they have the presence of mind and the confidence to say, yeah, I'm going to do that.
Maybe the way I would thread the needle is that each of them, in some iteration or other, when I asked the question, like, why you, all sort of said, it had to be done. Why not me?
Yeah.
It wasn't like I'm going to, I don't think any of them had hugely grandiose notions of changing the world. I think that one thing that is becoming clear in doing these interviews, Bridget Amiri is another one, who sort of didn't really know she was going to do the litigation around the teenage pregnant migrants at the border. And she's another one of the people who's just like, I was just doing law, like I'm not a huge flamboyant personality. And then it just became manifest that somebody had to,
like
argue.
Michelle Garza too.
Yeah. And so I think maybe this is what I would say, is that in speaking to them, I've been really interested both in that like, roll your sleeves up, someone's got to do it quality that I think is a bit gendered, but also, and I think it goes to, we were talking before about, this hysteria thing. I mean, I think many of my women heroes of the resistance, whether it's like Masha Gessen or Amy Siskind or Jennifer Taub or Rachel Maddow, who are doing this every day, are being told they're hysterics all the time. I am told I am hysterical very frequently, and like not always by my children. And I think that one of the things that, again, silences women is being told, like, you seem hysterical right now. And I have had that conversation many times. And I think that there is this thing for women that we're leading this double life, that even when I was like cozy at Stanford Law School, like even when you were cozy in law school and had your clerkships and something, you always a little bit have that sense, whether it's imposter syndrome or whether you're realizing how hard fought it is, that it could all get taken away. And I don't think I was ever perfectly sanguine that I was entitled to whatever I had. You know, for years at Slate, as the only woman on the masthead, I was begging them to hire more women. And it was just really all men all the time throwing like a, little Nerf ball around the office. And like, that's what it was. And I think that slight feeling that I could imagine this other Handmaid's Tale life, even if it wasn't manifest, I think was an anxiety that makes it easy to toggle back to that thing. For us, it's not hysteria because we sort of know it in our bones. We remember it. I remember what my grandmother's lives were like. And so I think that many of these women, it is not that they are hysterical, but that something was happening in the world that felt familiar or creeping or dangerous, and they just kind of torqued themselves to do it very quickly. There was just a fast recognition that this thing is happening and it's bad, and I think, again, I don't want to essentialize it. I don't think it's necessarily a woman thing, but it's a through line for me in many of these interviews that these women felt vulnerable to something before the men around them felt vulnerable.
Well, so we have talked about this on the podcast too, like just sort of when you call something out, maybe too early, maybe you're right too early, and you're hysterical. And my co-host Leah Littman was like, "But I was right. I mean, it happened eventually, but I was right." And I was like, "No, we're like Cassandra, destined to know the truth and not be believed." But I mean, it's this sort of thin line between, are you hysterical, or is it that you recognize it's all ephemeral?
Yeah.
Right.
And one of the things I've started to see again in doing the research for the book is that sort of there's like a prophecy element to this, that it's not just women in law. There's like this sort of the ancient biblical prophets who were just like reviled and nobody wanted to talk to them and nobody wanted to be their friends, but they were actually saying the truth. And that prophecy, like we've distorted the meaning of like biblical prophecy to mean foreseeing the future. It's not actually that. It's calling out sort of injustice in the present. And that it's interesting that has like really actually ancient biblical roots, and actually like women were allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just useful. Whenever I'm with a bunch of, I had lunch with Rebecca Traister yesterday, and we were by the end of it doing that like, that you do in the midst of impeachment. And whenever I am sort of, doing a hysteria check with one of my sort of heroes, I always have to sort of remember that I don't have to apologize for having this acute sense that something very, very profound is wrong, and that if I don't use whatever platform I have to sort of speak in that kind of key of prophecy, then like I think I am also enabling something that is very, very dangerous.
All right, so we have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to encourage all of you to step into the platform and either make a prophecy or just ask a question. All right, over here, Rabia, and then over here.
So this was a really fascinating conversation to listen to. And part of it was, I think, in terms of the periodization that was happening, and also in terms of intersectionality. It was striking that it's happening during February, Black History Month. So, for example, sort of thinking about the dilemma over complicity and legitimacy of the Supreme Court with a woman that has been harmed in a Supreme Court confirmation hearing. We have Kavanaugh, but we also have Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. And I wonder how this conversation would change if the line drawn in the sand was not with Christine Blasey Flore's treatment, but if we go back to think about Anita Hill's treatment. And then I started thinking, like, why is that not part of the conversation? I think in terms of the split screen thing, probably almost all Black Americans throughout American history have had that issue. I mean, W.B. Du Bois calls it that double consciousness of being in a society that treats you terribly, but then having the hope that things are going to be different. So I also wonder, again, in terms of thinking into the past with people who have grappled with that issue, that are not just coming to the shock of the United States not working in the past few years, that those people might be sort of lifelines. So for example, in terms of a guy that may have had that sense, so Martin Luther King saying, I may not get to the promised land with you, right, but you're still doing the struggle. So I'm just sort of wondering about those things.
I mean, I can speak to Anita Hill only insofar as, you know, I started covering the court after that. And so for me, that by the time I came to the Supreme Court, that was, you know, and I remember watching the hearings. I think the hearings were emphatically why I went to law school. But I think that the court, by the time I got there and was such a baby, the court was the court. And so it was different. For me, it was not different because what happened to Anita Hill was different. It was just that I missed it in terms of covering the court. But I absolutely agree, and I hear it all the time, that like the fact that this is shocking to me tells me how utterly, you know, I missed the boat for most of my life, and that this is the America that many, if not most, women have lived in. And I also think, you know, on the sort of, we have to fight because we have to get there. I think that's what I'm saying. I'm just less confident that we were going to get there in my lifetime. I really believed we were there. And
I guess, like, so how do you then sort of break it, so bake into that consciousness of white privilege into the story that you're telling, for example, in the book? That you, for instance, you thought we were there.
What's the question?
So in terms of sort of that, like, recognizing your own shock and sort of what you missed, and in terms of intersectionality and those types of things, like, so how is that coming into the book? So for instance, and I would characterize that to be white privilege, right? So is that in the book?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's working its way in, and I think for me, the most telling chapter for me is Vanita's chapter, because I have to learn about organizing, which is different from the lawyering that I described in the early chapters, and learning about what she's doing and thinking about legal structures failing, but organizing not failing that's, for me, the pivot of the book. And it's sort of both because I think it vaults me into thinking about race, but also vaults me into how I deal with my anxiety about judges not saving us. And so for me, I think where law breaks down, organizing surges in, and that was not something that I expected when I started this.
So can I say something about Anita Hill just briefly? I thought a lot about Anita Hill when the whole Kavanaugh confirmation was going on, and I was surprised that more people did not draw connections between the two episodes. But I'm not surprised that they didn't, because I think in one respect, Christine Blasey Ford's posture was very different from the way Anita Hill presented herself when she was before the Senate. I mean, she was almost stoic and dispassionate in recounting the treatment she'd experienced. And I understood why she had to be. Like, if she had been more emotional, more fiery, more strident, she would have been either an angry black woman or utterly unbelievable. And I mean, you know, David Brock famously called her a little bit nutty, a little bit slutty. Christine Blasey Ford presented in sort of traditional tropes of white womanhood, the same kinds of tropes that I think were emphasized by the anti-suffragists in 1920. She was there as a mother and a wife who was not there to bring down a man, but wanted to help. You know, I want to help, and I want to provide this information. I believe in the system. Her patriotism was sort of exactly that. Like, this is an act of patriotism, not self-service. And I think that was just really different. I don't think Anita Hill could have accessed that vein of presentation and the way that Christine Blasey Ford did. I don't know that any Black woman could have done that. I feel your point acutely because I was 15 in 1991, but I recognize immediately, okay, this is what they do to Black women who say things. And I understood that then, I understood that in law school, I understood that as a young professor, and I said nothing until I had tenure. And then, according to one of my colleagues at Berkeley, then I didn't stop talking, which is, maybe that's what you're supposed to do, but I totally get that. And, Black women have been miners' canaries on a lot of these issues for a really long time.
But also, I mean, I also think that what was interesting is watching the Republicans in the Senate reorganize themselves to not perform it again. And so they hire the sex crimes prosecutor. They're not going to, call her out to her face.
But was that just to reorganize it, or because it would have been even worse to do it to this
to a white woman? For sure. But I think it was sort of, to me, I thought this is going to, at least as a process, be something that sounds in the key of caring. Yeah. And it was, in fact, like they learned the lesson of just hide. Yeah. It was really stunning that the process that was crafted was even, that was the best they could come up with, was having a woman sit there like at a little tiny desk and ask questions about her fear of flying. And that's how they were going to do it.
So if I could put a plug in for a future BWLN program, in March, we are going to be presenting the Kavanaugh Files, which is a performance art exhibit that's being done by the Veritas Performance Lab here at NYU, where we will have a gender flip. So a woman will play Brett Kavanaugh doing his exact words, mimicking his posture at the hearings. So a man will play Christine Blasey Ford, and we'll see the work that gender does in those contexts. So please come for that. Okay, and we have back here, and then Riva.
I just want to make a comment that as much as we've been fighting, I think that as long as we have gerrymandering and the Electoral College, it's going to be even that larger a fight. So much of what we've accomplished has been undone, I believe, because of the gerrymandering that in many cases is controlled by men in the state legislatures. And then the Electoral College. And I understand the whole rationale behind the Electoral College. But, I've always believed in one person, one vote. Hillary Clinton lost because of the Electoral College. She won by 3 million votes I'm sorry.
Popular vote.
The popular vote. But I think that, in considering women's suffrage and women's rights, I think that we really need to really think in terms of the Electoral College as well. I know it affects everyone, but in particular, when you're an oppressed group, women of color, women in general, any oppressed group, it's going to limit whatever we do. And it really affected, the 2016 election really affected everything that we're experiencing now is because of that.
And it's not only is it a good reminder that, we live in a minority-majority rural country right now where, a minority-majority Senate is making decisions about, minority-majority voting rules, which is, we've got a minority-majority president picking minority-majority Supreme Court justices. And, everything is captive to it. But I also think it goes to this, for me, this existential question about voting, which is, we either believe in it and we're going to fight to have it make more sense, or we're going to do the next best thing, which is we don't know what. And so I just think the problem is we have this deeply structurally flawed system that is now worse and making things worse. And, we don't, every time I get into conversations about, what are we going to do? Pack the courts? What are we going to do? Reinstate the filibuster? What are we going to do? Reinstate the blue slate? How do we fix this? And it's back to that sort of theme of, these rules are structurally unsound to begin with, and how much of it can we burn down?
Question over here.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm a graduate of NYU worker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
starting law school, when I quit the practice of law, I became a New York City firefighter, and I was complaining about sexual assault at the same time that Anita Hill was complaining about it, and we were actually at the same conference together complaining about it. So I'm older than you, but before all that, I was a student of history, and I would just want to take it back to this morning, which is that if we know our history and we take the long view, then the times that we live in right now may not look quite as terrible. And you know, how can we let our foremothers down by kind of throwing in the towel when things get tough? And so, you know, I would just say that, you know, we need more than just lawyers, women lawyers of different races joining together. We need the educated women to take, to be with the less educated, the less privileged, whatever their race or gender, sexual orientation or whatever, that we all have to make common cause to get rid of the patriarchy and have, you know, justice for all.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I really think that this is one of the few ways in which the internet has made the world better. Is that I think we are able, you know, to talk to each other and to act and to organize and to inspire and to motivate and, you know, to talk across bubbles and sort of divides. And
Time.
Yeah.
Time. I mean, the fact that people in this room didn't really know what was going on with Anita Hill because you were born after the time period, I mean, that's depressing to me as a student of history. I mean, that's relatively recent history, let alone what we think of, you know, Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony. So, you know, it's really incumbent on us to know our history.
Mm-hmm. Riva, you'll have the last word.
Oh, goodness. So this was an incredible conversation by I'll speak for the whole room in saying we're grateful to listen to the two of you and could go on all day. So I was moved by all the conversation, Melissa raising what it's like to teach constitutional law these days. Very hard, very complicated to be teaching in the classroom right now. And yet when I'm doing it, I also think sometimes I want to try to shut out the present a little bit to give students any sense of a tradition that isn't just now. And so I don't know what your book is about, Dahlia, but when these Jeremiads could be claims on our Constitution, claims on the law that are not what the courts are going to claim the law is, right? But these women, the resistance, could be speaking for some other picture of what we're about. And I don't know that that's how you're presenting their story, because you're saying we've lost the courts, but maybe they're speaking for our tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it less ephemeral and less fleeting.
I'm throwing this out to you as a reading of really why they're moved to speak out. You know, this prophecy is really maybe also a claim on a past idea of what it is a past idea of what we might be.
I love it.
Meaning making, a different kind of meaning making.
And
Because
also,
it's not what we were.
Yeah.
It's what we might, different versions of the past of us, what we might have imagined ourselves yet could be.
Yeah, and I think that you know, I think words matter, and I think that a sort of fixed idea of words across time as a way of imagining what we might have been and what we might still be.
You know, it's versions of I have a dream.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On that note, in celebrating this important trust, let's all go forward and imagine what we still could be. Thank you.
Thank you.